Hey there, everyone. My name is Gage LaPierre, and today we're over here in the Ocala National Forest. And let me tell you, if you haven't been this way before, you should really come out and check out this area. It is such a large place. There's so much to explore, and it really gives you a sense of just the diversity and the scale of how old Florida used to look. Um, and right now, we're walking over here in an area known as a Juniper Wilderness Area. And if you know anything about wilderness areas, you'll know that it's a pretty unique management area in Florida. Um, but anywho, uh, right now we're actually walking through what's known as a scrub community. And so, how do I know that this is a scrub community, and what am I seeing that makes it so? All right. Well, for starters, let's just make some general observations about scrub communities. And so, scrub communities are often found in pretty close adjacency to sandhill communities. They often grade into one another. It's also worth mentioning that both scrub and sandhill communities, although they're found throughout the state of Florida, they typically occur predominantly on these ridges, these very deep sandy ridges that run and are scattered across the state. If you recall, we've mentioned these deep sandy ridges in the past, and it's worth mentioning it again that these deep sandy ridges, these areas were some of the first areas to emerge 25 million years ago when sea levels were much higher. So these were some of the first areas in the state, the first coastlines that we had. And so what we think is that these areas these communities are sort of a remnant of those earlier times. So now that we know basically where these scrub communities occur, let's just think about again what's below our feet. And as I mentioned, these communities are occurring on these very deep sandy soil profiles, and these soil profiles are often defined and categorized as what's known as an entisol, and that entisol basically just means that there is very little soil horizon development, and we're in an area, in this case, where it's just nothing but sand. All right, and so with both of those things in mind, where scrub communities occur and what's beneath our feet, let's make some general observations about what we're seeing here today and the species that we're seeing. So one thing that's very hard to not notice here in the Juniper Wilderness area is just how dominant the shrubs are. And this is indeed a defining element of most scrub communities. Um, Oftentimes, these scrub communities are not tree dominated, but rather shrub dominated. And so let's talk about some of the shrubs that we're seeing here today and are characteristic of Florida scrub communities. So a few species that we're seeing in high abundance here is myrtle oak and Chapman's oak. And so in the case of both of these species, um, these species don't grow very tall, but rather they grow very large in terms of their width, and they can often form thickets in scrubs. And something else that's worth noting is that in the case of both of these species, as well as many other species in Florida scrub communities, their range oftentimes do not extend outside of Florida, or oftentimes they are either, if they're not a Florida endemic, they are sometimes even being only found in Florida within certain areas. So certain species may not extend past certain ridges in the state. So Another shrub species another characteristic shrub species that we find is rosemary. And so Florida rosemary is very interesting because it actually is known to be allelopathic. So that simply, if you're not familiar with that word, it simply means that this is a species that is capable of producing chemicals that um, make the ground around it infertile or simply inhibit the growth of other plants. And so this is a very important species in scrub communities because it keeps some of these areas very open and sandy and bare. And so this is a very characteristic species, and it's typically found, it's typically one of the first species to colonize um, dune areas in scrub communities, as well as disturbed areas in scrub communities where it's sandy. So some other common species that we're seeing today and that we do witness in other communities in Florida include species that we've talked about before, like sand live oak, saw palmetto, and rusty staggerbush. So then in terms of the ground cover that we're seeing here today, and is often the case for most scrub communities, is that the ground cover is usually very sparse. We are seeing some threons, which are Aristida species, scattered here and there, and we're seeing several different species of hare's edge. Something else that one very glowing and popping set of species that we're seeing in terms of the forbs include things like Baldwinia and species like Liatris. And some of these Liatris species that we're seeing here today are also found in sandhill communities as well. And then just some other general species that you will find in scrub communities and sometimes are only found in scrub communities include things like Lechia, which are pine weeds. Certain species of pine weeds only are found in these scrub communities, and also a number of joint weeds and also ground lichens. And it's important to note that in the case of ground lichens, oftentimes this is a very characteristic element of scrub communities, where you can come across patches like this one where it's made up of a pretty interesting set of different lichens. And so interestingly enough, you can find these patches of lichen, and oftentimes there are multiple different species that can be found occurring in relatively close proximity to one another. This photo is one good example. This photo was taken down at the Archibald Station, and all 8 of these species were found growing right next to each other. This was not a choreographed photograph. So it just goes to show you that it's quite amazing things that can occur in the scrub. And then in terms of some of those rare species that I mentioned earlier, oftentimes one of the more famous species for scrub communities in terms of plants that we see in the ground cover that are rare include one particular set known as Dicerandas, or scrub mints. So there are several different species of scrub mints, and interestingly, some of these species are only found on certain ridges in the state. In almost each of these cases, unfortunately, these species are often endangered and hanging on by only a thread. Some species number less than 1,000 individuals. So this has been a pretty big concern among scrub enthusiasts for a very long time. And then some other rare species, which again, we haven't talked a lot about animals in these video series, but here is kind of a unique case where we can't avoid it because I actually have a lot in my face right now. So the Florida scrub jay is one particular rare species that you will find only in scrub communities, and this particular species has actually served as an indicator species for the health of scrub communities. It's often used as a way to diagnose the health of different scrub communities throughout the state. And for a long time, this species was on decline, but there are signs now that this species is recovering. And then another species similar, again, to sandhill, is you will see gopher tortoises in scrub communities, and in some areas you will see them in very high abundances. This includes areas in central Florida, such as the Lake Wales Ridge. And it's really worth mentioning that the scrub is just such a mysterious community. There are so many rare insects. There are so many rare animals. These include things like the Florida mouse, the short-tailed snake, and just so many other unique insects and critters that are only found in scrub communities. And still, in many cases, we do not know a lot about these species. All right, so last but not least, let's talk about the overstory. And here at Juniper Wilderness area and a lot of the scrubs across the state, there often really isn't a true overstory in these communities. It's not unusual for these scrub communities across the state to not have an overstory, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But it's worth mentioning now that one overstory species that does occur um, in certain scrub communities across the state is a very particular pine species known as sandpine. And sandpine is a very interesting species for a lot of reasons. One reason is that its cones are serotinous, and that simply means that its cones have a mechanism that allows its seeds to be released after a certain disturbance. And um, in other words, the cone of sandpine is covered in a thick wax that allows its seeds to be released only after fire. And so at this point, let's talk about some of the natural processes and disturbances that went into shaping Florida scrub communities and helped maintain them to this day. Fire has played a very important role in maintaining natural communities throughout the state. Fires would have occurred fairly frequently in sandhill communities, and it would not have been unusual for these fires to have made its way into scrub communities as well. And so there's a lot of reasons for that, and one is because oftentimes there's a lot of bare sand that would restrict the movement of fire through these communities. So then another reason is because oftentimes the shrub species in scrub communities are often not nearly as flammable as the grasses found in sandhill communities. Interestingly enough, there are species in scrub communities that have fire adaptations and biological cues that would suggest that fire did occur in scrub communities. And as I mentioned, sandpine is one of the premier species. So this raises the questions of, well, how often did fires occur in scrub communities? So the answer to that question is unfortunately still somewhat unclear in a lot of cases, and it's often pretty complicated. So depending on where you are in the state of Florida, some scrub communities may have burned would have been as frequent as somewhere around 5 years, whereas in other parts of the state it would have been closer to 60 years. And so this is a very large range, and again, this is one of the more probably one of the more mysterious elements of scrub communities. These factors that lead to longer fire intervals in scrub communities. It's often thought that the buildup of fuels that eventually lead to a fire in these communities is enough to often cause what's known as a stand replacing fire. And this would have occurred in scrub communities, especially in where sandpine occurs, such as the Ocala National Forest. And in one such case, there is some evidence for this. In one such case in 1935, it was recorded that a lightning-lit wildfire burned over 35,000 acres there in 4 hours. So yeah. And so even in the case of scrub communities where fire would have occurred at much longer fire intervals, unfortunately in some cases scrub areas have been degraded due to fire suppression, especially areas where the fire return interval would have been a little bit more frequent. And so stand replacing fires as well as these longer fire return intervals are two factors that have made managing scrub communities in Florida a bit complicated. So part of the problem with this is that oftentimes it's not clear what management actions should be taken when scrub communities aren't burned for a long period of time, and how should those areas be managed in terms of maintaining some of these rare species that rely on fire. And so many times mechanical means are often employed to help maintain scrub communities throughout the state. One example of this is right here that we're walking through now is this area is just outside of the Juniper Wilderness area in the Ocala National Forest, where a mechanical means via clear cut was used to somewhat mimic fire, both one maintain production of sand pine pulpwood, but also to try to mimic fire to some degree as a way to maintain both the community composition and the structure of these scrub communities. In terms of some of the threats that are facing Florida scrub communities, the chief among them has been and still remains the clearing of these scrub communities for various different human purposes, but mainly today for urbanization. So some other threats that are facing Florida scrub communities is, again, fire suppression. If fire is completely disabled in these communities due to human activities, then over time these communities will transition into what's often called a junk hammock, and many of the rare and endangered species that take place in these communities will disappear as well. And so last but not least, another threat that is facing scrub communities is habitat fragmentation. There are a lot of parcels of land throughout the state of Florida where scrub communities sit on, and due to continued urbanization, these communities are becoming more isolated over time. If these communities aren't connected to other larger parcels, some of the animals and some of the critters that make up those parcels will, over time, be lost.